All right, this is worksheet number 9 from chapter 5, talking about operations on imaginary numbers. So if you have homework questions, I'm not in class there to answer them today, so I wanted to make a video to help you in case you were struggling with any of these problems. The directions here state simplify each expression completely in terms of the imaginary number I. So let's start with number 1. It says the square root of negative 36. Well, remember, anytime you're taking the square root of a negative there, we could treat this as the square root of negative 1 times 36. And if you want to break it apart, you don't have to do all of these steps, but I'm going to treat it as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 36. I know the square root of negative 1 is I, and hopefully we recognize that the square root of 36 is just 6. So we have I times 6, which will give us the answer 6I. Looking at number 2. Number 2, we have the square root of negative 80. So again, we can think of this as, the square root of negative 1 times 80. And if you want to break it apart, you can. You don't have to do it this way, but right now I know that I have the square root of negative 1, so I'm definitely going to have an I in it there. Now the square root of 80, if you're not great with breaking down, square roots here and perfect squares, you can take this and break this down. This is like saying 8 times 10. 8 is the same as 2 times 4, and 4 is 2 times 2. Or 10 is the same thing as 2 times 5. So if you're looking at the factorization for 80, that is like saying, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. That's like 4 2's there, or 2 to the 4th. And then you have times 5. And we'll just pull out our pairs, right? So we've got a factor pair there and there. So we're going to pull out a 2. We're going to pull out a second 2. And then we still have our I out here. So we have 2 times 2 times I. And then still times the square root of 5, which is going to give us, in the end, 4I times the square root of 5. That is our answer for number 2. Now, number 3, you'll see here we have the opposite of the square root of negative 2 plus the square root of negative 18. So when we look to break this down here, I have the square root of negative 2 is going to become, we have the square root of negative 1 times a 2 inside, which the only thing we can actually pull out of this one is the I from the negative 1. So we're going to have here a negative I times the square root of 2 plus, now when we take our square root of negative 18, we have, plus the square root of negative 1 times 18. So 18 can break down, though, into 3 times 3 times 2. If you want to break it down there, you could say 2 times 9, and the 9 turns into 3 times 3. So what we're going to have here is this will become plus 3I times the square root of 2. And now when we look at this, this is, these expressions are like terms. So we could take those and add those together. When you have a negative I plus 3I radical 2's, you're going to end up with 2I radical 2. And that is the answer for number 3. Number 4, we have multiplication. So you have I times radical 2 times I times radical 3, or the square root of 3. So because multiplication is commutative, you could rearrange this and think of this as the square root of 2 times the square root of 3 times I, which will allow us then to have the square root of 6 times an I squared. Well, we know that I squared, right, is the same thing as negative 1. So when we take this here, we can really say this is like the square root of 6 times a negative 1, which will give us a negative square root of 6. And that is our answer there. So these are the answers for numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have 6I, we have 4I radical 5, we have 2I radical 2, and we have negative radical 6. If you have questions on any of those, hopefully this helped. Thanks for watching.